It's just crazy. And one, so that's Michael Harris, who was again one of the top rookies in baseball last year, and the third baseman Austin Riley is right at 100. And every time it seems the Phillies play the Braves, Austin Riley does some damage against them. So it's hard to believe that those are maybe the two worst offensive performers for Atlanta this year. Even Marcell Ozuna has a 110 OPS plus, a 797 OPS. But I mean, this team just pounds home runs. I mean, you've got, if I'm looking at the numbers right, you've got 7 guys in the starting lineup with double-digit home runs, with 12 home runs or more right now, and that's just absolutely bonkers. And I guess my question is, can they keep this up all year? Like this seems the rate at which they're pounding the ball doesn't seem sustainable over the course of a full season. Is this something that they can keep going? This entire lineup acting like this?
I mean, I think this lineup is deep, and it's probably the deepest one that they've had during this 5-year run of division titles. But, I don't know that they can keep this rate up. I mean, over the last, for the first couple of months, it was just a couple of guys here, a couple of guys there. Michael Harris was struggling. But since the start of June, end of May, this lineup started to click in a lot of ways. Ozzy Albies has come alive from the left side. Eddie Rosario's had an unbelievable last 2 weeks. He's got something like 5 home runs in his last 7 games. Michael Harris won NL Player of the Week this week. He's hit over 500. He's come back around after a really slow start. And what it's done, I mean, you've got the usual suspects in Ronald Acuna and Matt Olson, Sean Murphy's come in and just added to the lineup, really. So, I mean, there's not a lot of places to go get outs. I mean, you mentioned Austin Riley. I mean, he's been in the top 10 in MVP voting the last 2 seasons, and he's kind of been the guy that's not really had the hot streak yet. So, I think it's a really, really good lineup. I don't know that they're going to continue to hit home runs at this rate that they're on right now, but I do feel like, they've got to be one of the better offenses in the league.
It feels like, as I've been kind of looking at their schedule lately, I think I saw that they've played 3 teams with a winning record over their last 17 games. Have the Braves kind of had an easier schedule of late?
No doubt. May was ridiculously hard month for them. They played a ton of the AL East, and everything. And then June, it was like there was a series with the Mets and there was this series with the Phillies. But the rest of the schedule was kind of an opportunity for them to, take advantage and really put the pressure on the rest of the division. And, obviously the Reds are red hot now, so they've changed. That's changed the calculus a little bit too. This was an interesting week right here with how well the Phillies and the Reds were both playing. But yes, this month, this was an opportunity for them. And, they kind of survived May. And I think May was, looking back on it, I think that was the toughest month that their schedule, they'll have the whole season. So, it's one of those things. I mean, you play those bad teams, you got to take advantage of it. And I mean, it's as so far, they've done that.
What do you make of the schedule? The fact that there are far fewer interleague games, the fact that the Braves are coming to Philadelphia for the first time this season, and it's actually closer to late June than it is really to early June at this point. First series starts on June 20th. First time these teams, only the second series these two teams have played. And then, like I mentioned right before we started talking, that this is going to be the only series these teams play again until September, when they'll play each other 2 more series in September, and then that's it. I mean, it feels weird, and I'm not sure that I like the fact that these divisional games have been trimmed down in favor of interleague games, more games against the American League East, and get those games in against the Tigers and the White Sox. I'd like to see these two teams play each other a little bit more, and not just because the Phillies need head-to-heads in order to get back in the division race if they're going to do it.
No, I mean, there's some things I like about it and other things I don't. And I mean, it does seem weird that, we've waited this long really for the Braves and Phillies to meet. I think that's a downside to it. I have enjoyed seeing a lot of the teams that we don't normally get to see on a year in, year out basis. But, I mean, you just think back the last 2 seasons, if you get off to a bad start, like you said, I mean, there's just less head-to-head opportunities to to run down an opponent, in a lot of the ways. And we've seen the Braves do that for 2 straight seasons. This year, they obviously got off to a good start. And, I think it's going to be tough on the Phillies and the Mets just because you just don't have that many opportunities, as far as it goes. So, I'm a little, I don't know. I think, I think I'm going to miss some of those divisional games late in the season and whatnot too, but just because, I expect the Phillies and the Mets to, really stock up at the trade deadline. I think it'll still be a good race. But at the same time, I've enjoyed, seeing a lot of these teams that you just don't get to see, before. It was 3 or 4 seasons before you might see Mike Trout come to Atlanta or, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good trade-off. I mean, I know Phillies fans would love to see, Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout come to town, as would Atlanta fans. And it's great to see some of those guys from Seattle and the other, the other teams that you don't normally get to see all that often. So there is that trade-off. I do get that, but I do miss these series against I don't miss series against the Marlins and Nationals all that much as I like beating up on the Nationals. Those games just don't have a whole lot of juice to them anymore. Right. But these series against the Braves and Mets certainly do. So before we just kind of jump into some of the other teams around the National League, what's your sense on the Phillies? What is your sense on the slow start they keep getting off to year after year, and the fact that they've kicked it into gear here in June? And what is the gap, as you see it, between the Phillies and the Braves? We obviously saw the Phillies beat the Braves in 4 games in the division series last year, but if you're taking a longer view of things, it's pretty clear the Braves are a superior team.
Well, I think the Braves have probably a more overall depth, but I mean, I don't think the gap's that far. I mean, really, when I look at these,
is it a 9-game gap on paper? I guess is what I'm asking.
I don't think so, really. And I mean, you can go back to this is funny, and I've thought about this every day probably since the last time I was on the show with you. I remember, at the end of last year, we're sitting there 2 weeks to go, and the Braves have run down the Mets, and at the time we talked, I mean, there was some question whether the Phillies were even going to make the playoffs, and I can remember, I don't think I said anything too derogatory, but 2 weeks later, look how different everything was. I mean, the Phillies look like the best team in the National League, and they proved that. They got hot at the right time. So I don't think the gap's that much. I mean, I know the Marlins are having a storybook start to this season, but the Phillies are still the team, to me, that's got the firepower in a series to go head to head with the Braves. And I think that's why this series here, I hate that we got a rain out right here, because I thought it was a pretty good measuring stick, for both teams, honestly. And and I mean, they were the 2 hottest teams, well, besides Cincinnati, but they were 2 hottest teams, in the National League coming into this series. So, I think I haven't got to watch the Phillies too much this time. I know Trey Turner's better than he's playing. Yeah. And I just feel like, that's a guy, if you get in one of these short series, he can beat you. He can single-handedly beat you. We've seen Bryce Harper do that. You've seen Kyle Schwarber do that. You've got 2 stud frontline pitchers in Nola and Wheeler. I think I think the bullpen, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the bullpen's actually pitched a lot better.
Bullpen's been good.
Bullpen's
been good.
And that was something that was always seemed like that was kind of the difference. When it come right down to it, the Braves bullpen would pull them out in a lot of tough spots and the Phillies just couldn't do that. So, I see these teams as pretty similar. I think the Braves might have just a little bit more firepower at this point, but as we've seen, anything can happen once you get to
I think the big difference between Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think the big difference between these 2 teams right now is simply the power difference. I think pitching staff-wise, I think the Phillies starters are pitching as well as anybody in baseball right now. But they struggle to put runs on them. When they hit home runs, the Phillies win games.
Right.
When they don't hit home runs, they don't hit games. And that sounds really simple and dumb, but this team goes into stretches where they become a singles machine, and that's kind of what's happened over the last few games. They were pounding the ball in Arizona, and then in Oakland, they reverted back to, a bunch of slap hitters, and it's the Bryce Harper power drain has been really eye-opening. He's still doing a lot of good things, but has a slugging percentage, I think, under 300 in his last 20 games or so. It's just the power stroke from a lineup that really really every big moment in the playoffs last year virtually was a home run of some kind. And